In a week, a month, in which our world is racked with violence and with death and with struggles both great and small, I'm left looking for hope. But I do know that hope is always all around us. We might have to search for it, put in a little extra effort. We might have to look really hard. We might have to sort of generate our own little bit of hope even. We might need a hero. Seem to be no shortage of that, as you've no doubt seen, even if it's not really your thing. Superheroes in particular are having quite a cultural moment. In the movie theater and the small screen and all sorts of other media. If you have children of the right age like I do, you cannot get away from this. It's okay, I like it too, actually, so that's fine. But there's another type of hero I'm thinking of today. Not super, but rather ordinary, because I don't know any superheroes myself. And if I did, I suppose I would be compelled to keep their identity secret from y'all anyway, right? But I know a lot of ordinary heroes. People who, faced with challenges large or quite small, did the thing that they could do. And so in this season, when we talk about generosity and how we can support our congregation with our finances and time and love and in other ways, this is the sort of hope I'm looking for. Not superhero hope, but ordinary hope. I said some words a few minutes ago from Norbert Čapek, a Unitarian minister who lived and worked primarily in Prague during the first half of the last century, more or less. He and his wife Maja created the flower ceremony that many Unitarian Universalist churches celebrate each year. The other thing to know about him, there are many things to know about him, but the other thing relevant to today is he was imprisoned and died in a Nazi concentration camp. He had been both preaching against the Nazis and also working with resistance movements in his hometown. His specific crime was listening to foreign radio broadcasts, by the way. So when I say his words again, just briefly, you might think of what he ultimately sacrificed. His daughter also died with him in that camp. He wrote, "It is worthwhile to live and fight courageously for sacred ideals. Be grateful, my soul, my life was worth living. He who was pressed from all sides, but remained victorious in spirit, is welcomed into the choir of heroes. He who overcame the fetters, giving wing to the mind, is entering into the golden age of the victorious." Just an ordinary man doing ordinary things in extraordinary circumstances. I think of other ordinary heroes too, though, like a utility lineman whose name I do not know, I will never know at this point. Decades ago, though, a mentor of mine was the minister of a Unitarian Universalist church, but more importantly was the chair of the board of Beacon Press, which is a publishing company founded by Unitarians. They publish a lot of really great stuff. You should check them out. You've probably read something of theirs, not even necessarily realizing it was from Beacon Press. In any case, he was the chair of their board at this time, and at this particular time, they had been approached to publish the Pentagon Papers in their entirety, which is like a really big book, by the way. And for those of you below a certain age, I should maybe explain what the Pentagon Papers were. It's been a while now. But they were essentially huge amounts of evidence of the government's lying and manipulation and just plain bad decisions in the Vietnam War. Various newspapers have been publishing excerpts. They would do so until the government shut them down, and then they would hand off the papers to the next newspaper to publish more of it until the government shut that paper down, etc. Anyway, Beacon Press had been asked to publish the entire thing shortly after those newspapers were publishing excerpts. And so as Beacon Press was considering this, the FBI got wind of this, and various government agencies started putting pressure on the press's staff and board not to publish this. So when a utility lineman came to Reverend Ed Lane, my mentor's office one day, it was for a very, very specific reason. Reverend Lane, he said, I think your phone line is being wiretapped. This was long enough ago that you had to put a physical wire to actually tap. Now you just hit a button on a computer somewhere, I presume. I'm not familiar with the details of wiretapping. So this lineman had been working on some lines and had noticed a strange wire attached to a phone line that he knew should not be there. Mr. Lane, he said, I'd be happy to show you where it is. It's right outside. Anyway, I say this because that lineman could have done many different things. He could have ignored the wire he saw. He could have seen it and decided not to tell Ed Lane about it. And indeed, by telling him, I'm sure that lineman was exposing himself to some amount of risk just for doing that. So anyway, for the next few months, Reverend Lane had some incredibly boring conversations on his phone line and some very interesting ones on a series of payphones around town. I think of people like Maria Cook, which is probably not a name you have maybe heard of before. Even in our Unitarian Universalist history classes, she's not usually a prominent figure. But by some accounts, there's arguments about this, but by some accounts, she was the first woman in America licensed by a church to preach. Certainly not the first one to preach, but the first one to get some sort of approval to do so. Note that women throughout history have preached, whether they were allowed to or not. But Maria Cook not only preached her truth, her Universalist truth, it seems from what we know of her that she preached it everywhere, all the time, to anyone who would listen, and plenty who would not. She was so persistent at it, in fact, that in 1811, a Universalist church gave her a letter of fellowship, which was essentially a seal of approval certifying her as a preacher. Shortly afterwards, she was so frustrated with people's efforts to stop her, including inside Universalist circles, that she tore up that letter and moved on. But anyway, she never left Universalism as an idea. She preached. And like many in her day, she went town to town preaching to churches and gatherings. Anyone who would have her, some of them paid her something or would at least put her up for the night. In 1813, though, she ran afoul of some of those many people who did not like the idea of women preaching, or maybe the idea of anyone preaching Universalism, or both. And she was arrested by the local law authorities, nominally for being a vagrant. Though, as I said earlier, she was a traveling preacher. She was, in fact, staying with friends in the town at that moment. She was not out of house. And when they came to arrest her, she did an early version of what we might call nonviolent resistance. She simply refused to move. They asked her to walk out to the wagon, and she said no. They ultimately had to carry her, deposit her in the wagon, drive the wagon to the judge, where she again refused to get out of the wagon, so they carried her in to see the judge. And then she refused to answer any of his questions about herself or her situation. And when he threatened to jail her, she replied, "You can do as you please. I have seen demons in the seat of justice before now." She then refused to walk to the jail, so again they carried her. After a few weeks in jail, apparently the entirety of which she spent telling her fellow inmates and the guards about Universalism, they released her, probably to get rid of her at that point, frankly. And then I think of people I know personally, too. I think of, and I mean this completely sincerely, it was such a small thing, but such a wonderful thing. My sweet neighbor, who, though all her kids are long grown and out into the world, she put up one of those slow down, there are children in this neighborhood signs about a month after we moved in. Because suddenly there were not just my kids all over the street, but a dozen or more kids out in the street and in the yards all the time, every evening it seemed like. She wanted them to be safe Fortunately, we live on a cul-de-sac, so there's not too much traffic. And I say this because whether you're a preacher or a utility worker or a nurse, as my neighbor is, or a neighbor, whatever it might be you do for work or for fun or for those you love, you have the opportunity to be an ordinary hero too. And we know that it takes a lot of ordinary heroes to make any community work. That's certainly true here at the Unitarian Universalist Society of Mill Creek. Our members help teach our children, help lead worship. They do maintenance around the buildings and grounds. They help keep track of our finances. They coordinate our various efforts to do good in our world. And I could probably name a dozen more things given a little more time. Our members also contribute to our shared endeavor together with their pledges, which, as I keep saying, but it's true, you will hear a lot more about in the months to come. So friends, as we worship together today and in future Sundays, as we share time together, I encourage you to think about the ways you and those around you can be, indeed already are, ordinary heroes.